All right, everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the last part of this year's virtual job search series hosted by ONTPD and TCAN. My name is Nicole Fernandez-Dias, and I'm one of the leaders of this job search series. Before we get started, a few housekeeping things that I wanted to go over with you guys today. So the session today is going to be recorded and will be sent out once the recorded link is available to everyone who registered for this particular session. So if you can't remember whether you registered for this particular session or not, the QR code on the current slide will take you to the registration survey where you can register for this session. Thank you to all of those who submitted questions beforehand. We have sent those questions to our speakers today who've tried their best to incorporate them into the talk. Any question that we do not answer with the talk, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the discussion today. Also, feel free to utilize the chat option to submit questions. Our moderators will be submitting questions via the chat today, and our speakers will answer them in the chat as well. We'll be saving that chat text and sending it out to all who registered for this session as well. Lastly, throughout this session, you'll be getting a QR code and link to our post-session evaluation survey. It should take less than a few minutes to complete that survey. Please provide us feedback on this session or any other parts of the job search series so we can make sure that we are meeting your needs. And I lied, I said lastly before, but one more thing, be on the lookout for the end of the year job search survey that goes out towards the end of March and April. That's where we kind of detail individual fellows and transitioning NEOs, individual job searches, and are able to kind of modify this curriculum to best serve your needs. So please pay it forward and make sure that you're filling out that survey for us. And with that, I'll now pass it on to our moderators for today. If you'll like to go ahead and introduce yourself, moderators.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Morgan Hill, and I am an assistant professor of pediatrics at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Really excited to be here with you guys this afternoon. I am moderating this along with Teresa, and we are going to just be helping man the chat. I'm going to be entering in some questions that you've already submitted. Also, feel free if you don't want to post a general question in the chat, if you want to send it to me directly, I can pop it in there for you. But we just want this to be really helpful for you. And with that, I am going to introduce Teresa, and she will then introduce our speakers.
Hello, everyone. I apologize for not having my camera on. I'm en route to one of our section on neonatal perinatal research conferences. So I am a third-year fellow at Walter Reed, and I am very happy to join everybody. I'm one of the regional fellow representatives for TCAN. Next slide. So first, we have Dr. Liz Bonachea. She's originally from Miami, Florida. She came to Nationwide Children's Ohio State 15 years ago for residency. She stayed for fellowship, then joined the faculty. She serves as the director of the Neonatal Perinatal Medicine Fellowship, as well as the Super Fellowship Director for Department of Pediatrics. She is a member of the Organization of Neonatal Perinatal Medicine Training Program, Directors Executive Council, and she was integral and the development of the NeoFlip classroom, which many of us use for our physiology education. Next slide. Dr. Reber is originally from Cincinnati, Ohio. She completed her residency and fellowship training at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Ohio, and she is currently a professor and the executive vice chair of pediatrics, as well as the division chief of neonatology for Texas Children's Hospital, Baylor College of Medicine. And finally, we have Dr. Savage, who is from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and completed her residency at Northwestern University Children's Memorial Hospital. She then went to the University of California, San Francisco for fellowship, and she returned closer to home and is currently a professor of pediatrics at the University of New Mexico. She is a former chair of the section on neonatal perinatal medicine for the AAP and one of the founders in Women in Neonatology. So welcome to everybody. I think, Dr. Bonachea, you have the slides for the didactic portion.
Sure do.
Perfect, and I will pass it over to you.
All right, can you see the correct screen?
Yes. I believe we have the right slides.
Because I'm going to start rolling otherwise. All right. It's a pleasure to be here with you. We have a lot of material we're hoping to cover with you, and we really are focusing in on those things that you have posed in the questions before this session, the feedback from last year's session, and questions that you will parenthetically enter into the chat as we go. So please don't hesitate to get those questions out to us. And like we said, there are avenues to ask it privately if you feel more comfortable with that. So we are going to talk about job negotiations. However, the principles that we're going to discuss apply to a number of different types of negotiations. Of course, when you move from job to job, but also at different points in your career where you may be negotiating for a leadership position, other opportunities, or changes in how you work. So what we're going to do is go over understanding your personal priorities related to this first attending level job. We're going to talk about the mechanics of the negotiation process. We're going to get perspectives from somebody who is doing the hiring and negotiation with our new graduates. And then we're going to identify hopefully some individual areas that you can work on prior to your next negotiation or prior to a first or second interview. So in terms of the application season, TCAN has put on a wonderful series here. So you have already gotten opportunities to talk about obviously CVs and cover letters, the interview, panel discussions, and now we're really getting into the heart of selecting a job and negotiating for the components of that job. So I want you to consider thinking about the end first, right? So just like we think about what is it going to take to get a baby home from their NICU experience, we're going to think about what is that perfect job going to look like? How close to that can I achieve? What does a successful agreement look like? So here's one resource. This is my cue to remind you that we will put a resource guide into the chat at the end of this discussion, so you have access to that as well. And so you have to understand what you want out of a job, understand what the person at the other side of the negotiation table is trying to achieve, and try to find a win-win solution that gets you both happy and you leave employed. So try to reframe your thinking. If you're used to a used car negotiation type of environment, this is not akin to a job negotiation. So you cannot go to two leaders in two programs, in two practices, and get the exact same product. So you are going to have wildly variable components of your offers, and you need to think about where your trade-offs exist. You also need to make sure as you embark in this first series of negotiations that you're preserving the relationships between all the parties, because you may come to find that years down the road, you need to pursue a new opportunity and you may negotiate with some of the same individuals that you had previously talked to. Even in the absence of that, our community is quite small, so folks talk. So you want to make sure that you're always professional and personable in the negotiation process. One of the challenges in win-win negotiation and job hunts is that you have relatively little private information on the party of the division chief or practice director that you are privy to. So you know what you're looking for in the negotiation, but you don't necessarily know what they're specifically looking for or what they can actually offer to you. And the components as far as salary and benefits and call expectations and FTEs, they're actually quite opaque. So unless you know an insider at the program, a lot of times you're entering into these negotiations with very little understanding of what is achievable and what is equitable at that particular location. It's really, really important that you remember you are negotiating a job offer and not a salary. You need to think much broader than just financial considerations in the negotiation process. When you have come to an agreement with a practice or with a division that they are going to offer you a job, the contract and offer letter, and we can talk more nuance of that in a minute, really has these following major components. So there's terms of the employment. So how long is your contract term for? What are the circumstances under which you can terminate this contract or your employer can terminate the contract? Some level of detail about your work schedule should be provided, highly variable. But you should have some sense of what the clinical expectations are. And if RVUs are a component of your employment, that should be spelled out in your contract. Similarly, salary and other compensation metrics are the third major category of your contract or offer. And then there will be a significant pile of legalese in the contract, particularly in relation to malpractice coverage and to non-compete agreements or restrictive covenants. If these are new words to your vocabulary, simply put, non-competes and restrictive covenants limit your ability to leave one institution and then go practice for a direct competitor of that institution in the near term. We need to understand what we're trying to negotiate for and why it's important to you. So folks often are focused in on salary, but really time and how you spend that time in your work is your most precious commodity. So you can see here a laundry list of things that may be important components of your job offer well beyond salary. So thinking about the resources you need to be successful in your specific ambitions. What sort of professional development may be useful to you? How can you get your national reputation built with things like traveling to conferences? You need funds for that. What type of clinical work you do has become highly variable in most neonatal environments where there's more than one practice site or more than one type of team you may serve on in almost every clinical environment you're going to go to now. As you consider the salary and benefits, most people ignore the benefits, but that can be incredibly important. So retirement benefits can significantly contribute to the total financial remuneration you're getting from your job. And health considerations and health benefits are hugely important as you think about what out-of-pocket expenses could look like, what good mental health care and support looks like. It's also really important to understand what is relevant to your needs as far as childcare and education considerations. So you may be in environments where you can get free tuition for college for your child, and that is a huge financial benefit. It's also really important to consider caregiver leave. I'll touch more on this later on. And then understand that even things like your start dates and vacation needs may be negotiable. So a good job negotiation is not a business transaction. You should not be entering it thinking, what can I get out of this person? So this is a process that takes time. It takes self-awareness. So you need to understand what you're bringing to this job opportunity, and more specifically, what your goals are and what you're going to need to meet those goals. And you also have to understand the other party's goals and needs. So try to reframe your strategy around the concept of what resources do I need to meet our mutual goals. I spend a lot of time talking about money, so I have these money rules. So rule number 2 is very pertinent to job negotiations, and it's reduce the zone of discontent. So if you do a Venn diagram of the job you want and the job you wind up getting, everything in the middle makes you happy, and everything on the outside makes you burned out. Okay, so try to align your job search with figuring out how to maximize your zone of content in your job. So I'm sure you have your cell phone because we all do. So take a quick snap of this, and I'm not going to call you out on it if you don't do it, but I would highly suggest this exercise as a little bit of homework, and so think about what are your 3 top priorities as you're embarking in the job hunt. So clearly you've limited your first visits and who you sent your CVs and cover letters out to based on your highest priorities. But now think about within that consideration of the places you've already selected, what are your top needs? So thinking about what are the big picture, if you've got financial concerns, what are the components that fold up under that? Are you worried about moving expenses? Are you worried about childcare expenses? Are you worried about student loans and thinking about creative ways to address those? So this is your private homework to prepare yourself before a negotiation. One more second to take a picture. I was remiss in welcoming everybody. I'm thrilled to have you all here. And I know many more of you will be joining us online later, watching the recording. So welcome, welcome. I know it's a very busy time for everybody. All right, logistics. So the foundation for the negotiation should be laid out to some extent in the first interview. You should be discussing the basics of what are the clinical expectations, what are your long-term goals in that first interview. You're also using that as an opportunity to make connections. So questions in the first interview could help you clarify some of the topics that we will negotiate on later. So understanding what's the caregiver leave policy, how is salary determined, and how is gender and racial ethnic equity ensured in salary. Also, the opportunity to make connections with folks who have been recently hired is key in that first interview process, because that will potentially inform your negotiation with that insider information. It's reasonably uncommon to talk about salary numbers in initial interviews, though I have seen that happen more and more now, but understanding how salary is determined is certainly important. After the first visit, and often a second visit, a formal offer would be extended. It's really key to collect all of the supporting data you can to consider how you're going to evaluate that offer. So we'll talk in detail about salary. I've listed some resources here at the bottom. You can get data from Doximity and Medscape. Understand that that salary data is just self-reported, non-validated, but it is freely accessible. So it gives you a relative ballpark to start with. There is data through the AAAP and the MGMA, academic practices and typically private practices, respectively. That data is near impossible to get your hands on as a fellow applying for a job. But that's probably the highest value data set. And the one in between these two, which is well validated but limited in application, is the AAMC data set. So this is readily accessible for a small fee. Most every institution has at least one, if not more, people who have access to this data set. I buy it every year and it's pretty modest. And it is academic oriented. So it's for jobs that are affiliated with medical schools. This data is probably pretty rich compared to the things that you can get by free self-report. So it breaks down by geographic location, by sex, at least as reported by the institution. And there is a bit of emerging racial and ethnic data. Neonatology has a richer data set than many of the other specialties, just based on size and number of respondents. But that is a limitation. So here are some examples of what this data looks like. I will urge you to reserve your rage temporarily as you look at the first part here. So it will provide data such as for assistant professors in neonatology, median salaries, for white women. And then you can see here significantly lower median salaries for URM, female physicians in neonatology, and the highest for white men. We will talk more about gender inequity at the end. This data set will also provide geographic breakdowns. So here you see a roll-up of all assistant professors in this example in the Midwest. And you can see that the 25th percentile is 237 and the median is 268. So when you consider this data, remember that in a given rank, that can reflect somebody who is being hired right out of fellowship in year one. And it could also reflect somebody who's been in the assistant professor role for many, many years, potentially 7 to 10 plus years if they have not yet been promoted. So that salary range could be very significant depending on how long you've been in practice. So it's not uncommon for institutions to say, hire somebody in at the 25th percentile, and then you get annual raises that eventually float you up to the 75th percentile. All right, a couple of concepts to understand in terms of negotiation formats. So when you're negotiating, it's really important to understand your BATNAs and as best you can understand what's the ZOPA. And I'll explain those terms. So your BATNA is the best alternative to negotiated agreement. So in a really big picture sense, your BATNA for job A may be, I'll take job B, or I'll continue to interview at other first interview places that I've considered. For the person on the other side of the table, it may be that if you don't want to take this job, my BATNA is hiring another candidate. So you can only identify your own BATNA and then consider as best you can what the other party's BATNA is. So what does my boss need? So maybe they're hiring one position, but they would really love somebody with a specific interest in one type of clinical rotation. So they're really looking for somebody to staff all these level 2 hospitals, or they're really looking for somebody who has an interest in BPD. Okay? And then you need to consider whether that's acceptable to you or not. If you're making a request in negotiation, you need to consider what is the social or physical capital that my ask requires. So when you're asking for something like, can I delay my start date to August 1st? That may be a very simple ask versus if you're asking for something with a significant financial impact. It's also really important to understand if there's any precedent for what you're asking for. So if everyone that comes in on a specific salary, you're not likely to have success negotiating a higher salary because that would be inequitable. The ZOPA is that overlap between what the practice director or division chief is willing to accept and what you're willing to accept. Okay, so that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that win-win where both parties are going to leave satisfied with the negotiation. So here's an example. You don't necessarily need to ask for the end goal. So let's say one day you would love to be a program director, but you're fresh out of fellowship. So there are things that you can consider that have varying degrees of ZOPAs from the perspective of your needs and the needs of the division chief. So if you're coming in asking to get reduced clinical time because you want to get a master's of medical education, that's a very tough ask for the division chief because it may be inequitable compared to other people they've hired. However, if you want to ask for money to attend, the APPD educator conference, that may be a much simpler ask with a much wider ZOPA. Other examples could be just allocating your clinical time differently so that you're with the trainees more. or bringing you into a role on a specific fellowship or residency committee could be another way of approaching a negotiation. So you can see that for everything you're asking, there's a series of questions you have to ask yourself. How important is this to me? Right? Because you're never going to compare apples to apples jobs. Okay, so you need to think about relative priorities. Whenever possible, what data do you have to back up your ask? So if you're going to ask for an adjustment in salary, then you ought to know what the percentiles are on AAMC and other resources to back up that ask. Did you make your ask as specific as possible? So it's much easier to have a cohesive negotiation when you're saying, I want to be on X committee, then I would like some role in education. And then think about prioritizing the outcomes. So what's the A goal? What's the B goal? What will you accept, even though it's not what you were really hoping for as the C goal? And make sure you're taking perspective of what this ask entails from who you're negotiating with. Okay, so I see a good question from Morgan about like, how much is too much? I'll get there. All right, so here are just some examples. If you're thinking like, that all sounds fine, but like I have no clue what exactly you're specifically suggesting we negotiate for. So salary may not be particularly negotiable. Benefits are almost always standardized across the entire practice group. So you're not going to get access to a retirement plan that somebody else isn't, and you're not going to get better health insurance coverage than somebody else is. So really, when you think about money, people focus in on salary. But salary may not be negotiable in order to preserve equity. So you could alternatively ask for a sign-on bonus or a bigger sign-on bonus. Clinical time is similarly really hard for a practice director or a division chief to give you less clinical time than somebody else in similar track circumstances. But you may be able to have some flexibility in how you spend that clinical time. It's really important here to understand the details of what's entailed in your offer and contract. And this is a point where it may be important for you to engage the services of a lawyer. And we can talk about some nuance of that in the Q&A if you would like. So here are some examples of things that may be very opaque to you, having never done this before, that you really need to understand. So if you have a contract that includes claims made malpractice, that means you're only covered for malpractice if a suit is actually brought while you work for them. Who will pay your tail? That coverage that allows you to extend out to any claims that are made later on for things that happened while you were employed. This is not a small consideration. It's very important, particularly in private practice negotiations, because tail costs in the 5 figures and sometimes high 5 figures. Which is still astronomically lower than for places like OB, where easily you could spend $200,000 on tail insurance. If you're considering caregiver leave, it's really important to understand how that is addressed. This is a major point of contention in many academic practices, private practices. Neonatology is not certainly unique to this, but it's very important in us given our demographics of our field. So if you're going to take a caregiver leave, say 12 weeks, what's going to happen with your call and service time? Is that forgiven in a sense, or do you just need to reallocate it? So you're basically not actually taking leave, you're just moving around where you're doing your work. Are you still bonus eligible if you take a caregiver leave and therefore don't meet certain RVU targets? It's also important to understand the limitations of that non-compete. Non-competes, it's not impossible to negotiate out of, but it's quite difficult. So you really need to understand the tenets of the non-compete. How long is it active? Does it limit you by geography or to specific competitor institutions, regardless of the distance? And then you need to understand how much of a deal breaker that might be, because it's very difficult to negotiate out of. Do you understand the parameters for things like bonus eligibility? Probably more important in private practice because the sums are relatively higher than in academic practices. Do you understand the contributions to retirement accounts and what you have access to? This could be as much as 10% of your salary is allocated to you through retirement vessels, so it's an important financial consideration. Are there opportunities for practice buy-in? And understand the parameters for promotion and tenure in an academic position. Okay. Private information hurts win-win negotiations. So the fact that you don't know each other's BATNA hurts. The fact that you're working with disparate timelines and often unclear timelines hurts. The fact that you don't know what's precedent or even what's negotiable doesn't help anybody. So that's why we want to demystify some of these components. And when it comes to things like timelines and BATNAs, I encourage you to be as transparent as you feel comfortable being. That will only help the negotiation process on both sides of the table. So when you really sit down for a negotiation, you need to know what the ground rules are. So establish who you're going to negotiate with once you have your offer. So understand how, when this is going to happen, and who it's going to happen with. One of the requests of the previous session was to give some scripts. So you'll see those in a moment. And so many of the negotiation asks are going to be something that your practice manager, your division chief can directly interface with you on, but some they will have to take to other parties, say a chair. You should negotiate all your asks at the same time. So this is not like nickeling and diming the car salesman, as I enjoy doing, where you finally haggle the price and then you throw in a request for all season mats. That's not what we're doing. So all your asks at one time. There is not a limit in number, but do not negotiate things just for fun, right? They should be things that are pertinent to you in terms of what kind of job you are seeking. Okay? So there isn't a hard cap, but it is perfectly acceptable to have 4 or 5 elements you're discussing. Just do it all at once, not we've reached an agreement and now I'm going to slide one more thing in. Okay. It's okay to ask for time. And again, I provide some scripts of how to do that. And then remember that you should not be getting something that is not equitable. That's not fair for anyone. So you are not going to be able to negotiate out of something that would put other people in your division or practice group in a bad position. So consider fairness and equity too. All right, so here are some scripts. So these revolve around how you're actually making your ask. Obviously, you don't need to do these word for word. Here's an opportunity if you want to take a picture, just to give you some idea of how to frame some questions. So sometimes you're asking for something. So I would love to have a formal role on this committee that fits with my career trajectory. It would be an important step towards a leadership opportunity. Fine, ask for that. If you want to ask for a sign-on bonus or relocation bonus, be specific. I'd like to request a one-time relocation bonus of $10,000. I base this estimate on what it's going to cost to relocate from this city to this city. Sometimes you're just asking for clarification. So can you please clarify X, the expectations for call and service when you're on leave, how it affects the bonus? You can ask for documents. Can you please share your promotion and tenure guidelines with me? Can you please share a bonus structure if you're able to do that? You can always ask for time. So let's say they say, I definitely want to hire you. I need you to go work on this unit because I have not enough people on it. And you're like, I don't want to do that. So it's okay to think about it, to say, I'd like to take some time to think creatively about how I can meet your needs. Can we speak again in 2 weeks, 3 weeks? This is also useful for, I really need to consider this. I'm on service or I have a million calls and I just need some time to actually think. If you're in the fortunate position of juggling multiple offers, first of all, make sure you understand the nuances that distinguish the offers, even if both of them seem equal on face. So if you're talking about things like FTE or clinical time, it's very different from institution to institution, both in how it's calculated and how it practically functions. So it's very different to do the exact same number of calls and service on a 100-bed unit with very high acuity versus on a 24-bed unit where you're going to be transferring patients out of high acuity. So you need to understand the intensity of the workload in addition to the clinical time. It's perfectly fine to reference an element of one offer in your negotiation with another party, but understand it may be completely non-pertinent or non-useful. So you might say, I have this other offer with this salary, and they may come back to you and say, that's simply not the salary range that we use in our institution. I wouldn't be able to provide that salary to you without truing up everybody beneath you's salary that's been hired previously. That's not going to be an option. So it may not be as powerful negotiation tool as it seems. It's really important to clarify timelines with each institution, right? And then stick to them. So if you say, can I get back to you in 2 weeks? Get back to them in 2 weeks. It's very off-putting if you sort of ghost or disappear. And then respect the fact that everybody's put a lot of time and energy into recruiting you. So beyond just being incredibly thankful and kind to everybody, especially the administrators who set up all of your visits, just make sure that you're treating everyone with respect in terms of the fact that if you have made a decision and you are not going to take that job, be prompt and honest. Don't continue to negotiate just to see what you can get if you're sure in your heart of hearts you're not taking that position. So here are some additional scripts. Again, feel free to snag this for future use. If you have received an offer and you're like, I want to think about this, and set the ground rules, you can say, I'm very excited to review this in detail. How and when would you like to discuss my clarifying questions and requests? Okay. It's perfectly fine to juggle timelines. So you can say, I have one more first visit next week. Do you have a specific timeline for when you need to discuss the terms of this offer? If you find yourself in a position where you are sure that you don't want to go on a first visit that you have scheduled down the road, let's say you had like 5 or 6 lined up because you panicked and the job market stinks, and then you're like, oh, I really don't actually want to go on that first visit because I've already received an offer from 2 places. Okay, here's an example of how you can do the breakup in a kind and respectful way. Again, keep it succinct. Most of us are overly apologetic. So thank you for considering me. I need to withdraw my application. Clear, not I can't make it this day. And then it's left open-ended if you just mean you need to reschedule or cancel altogether. And then some statement of recognition of how much effort went into everything that's been done thus far. Okay. Once you've decided not to take a position, I think it's very polite to, first of all, say it as soon as possible and say, after careful consideration, I've decided to accept a position at blank. It's not going to be a secret. And this is a very small community, so I think it's perfectly fine to say where you're going and that you were grateful for the time they took and that you look forward to our paths crossing, because they almost certainly will in neonatology. Okay, we have Dr. Chris Reber, who does a lot of negotiation lately, has been on a hiring spree. So we're going to have an opportunity to just pose a few questions as the person, seemingly in the power of the negotiation. How are you considering this process? So I am trying to stop share, and our giant videos are interfering with my process here. Okay, so free in the chats, and then I will otherwise be posing some questions. So how are you actually negotiating with applicants? Like, should I just shoot you an email or text, or are we going to be talking, Zooming, talking on the phone?
So it depends where we are in the process of the interview. Initially, it's really say, hey, here's what we're looking for at Texas Children's Hospital, at Baylor College of Medicine. What are you looking for? What are your interests? And so we have that initial touch base meeting. And if we decide that it's worth moving to the next step, we would have the interview process, and we talk, and through that process and meeting some of the faculty, you would learn more about Texas Children's Hospital. And really the negotiation happens after that. You would have a sense of what the offer is, not necessarily the salary per se, but you would, once we have that initial interview process, then, and if I offer you a position, at that point, we would have a conversation by phone to talk about what the actual offer is. And so you would be negotiating with me specifically. If you had asks that I can't guarantee I could give you through that negotiation, then I may have to backtrack and see if I can figure out if that can happen with the discussion with the chair or with some of my executives. But I will say, and I think you said that well, when you're a graduating fellow starting in a faculty position, there's not a lot to negotiate. And that's a good thing, right? If you go into a negotiation and suddenly I'm offering you $30,000 more and I'm going to give you a lot less clinical time and I'm hiring a bunch of faculty, you might be a little bit suspicious, right? You might say, but wait a minute, is that person not getting equitable clinical time or pay or so? So I hope that what I do as a division chief is make sure that things are equitable, and I'm very transparent with you and say, this is what I can negotiate and this is what I can't negotiate, because I want things to be equitable. For all of my new faculty starting right out of fellowship, I want you to be reassured that you all are making the same amount of money and that you're getting the same amount of clinical time.
When would you recommend folks address issues that are potentially sensitive, coming through the match process? These might even be like illegal questions to bring up. So when do you want to hear from folks if there are specific spousal and partner considerations, like to physician recruiting or other details? And when would you encourage folks to bring up things like caregiver leave?
honestly, the earlier the better if you want my help in navigating that. And that would be partly my job, is helping you navigate that and making sure that you have the resources you need, or that the resources that you do need are here in Houston. So I think earlier, the sooner versus later, because this is a little bit different. It's not just a 3-year fellowship program. This is something that you're hoping to make a commitment longer term, not always, but that's what you're trying to find, that right fit. So the sooner that I know that, the sooner that I can help you navigate whether this is the right position or not for you.
All right. What are some examples of things that are minimally or not negotiable? And then what are things that are pretty easy for you to negotiate for or leverage?
I think you articulated the things that are difficult to negotiate. Benefits, those really aren't negotiable. Those are through the Baylor College of Medicine and most College of Medicines that are affiliated with that academic site, or through the private practice. So most benefits are not negotiable. I would say, what types of clinical time? You articulated that well. So I do try to keep clinical time pretty equitable across the board for my junior faculty who are starting. I'm assuming we're talking about junior faculty. It would be different, of course, if you're coming in as a medical director or coming in as a fellowship director. That would be different. But so the clinical time is negotiable, depending where you are in your training, in your faculty position. But the types of clinical time, and you have to be a little bit careful of that. And my advice about that is, I know what I need, right? I need ECMO physicians. So you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot and say, I'm just not willing to do ECMO, unless you're just not willing to do ECMO. But you also don't want to lie about it, right? You also don't want to say, yeah, sure, I'll do 16 weeks of ECMO. I don't ever ask for that, by the way. And then get here and I find out, no, I really don't want to do that. So I think you have to be honest with yourself and be flexible. And I think that's also true as you're talking about what your interests are. I would advise, and I've had both extremes. I've had folks who really have no idea what they want to do academically, if you're looking at an academic position. And then the opposite extreme, which is, I want to do XYZ, and very rigid about, I want to do XYZ. And when I say, well, we don't have XYZ here, they say, well, oh, that's okay. I'm all right with that, right? And so we kind of go back and forth. So I think you want to have an idea of what your interests are, but yet be flexible. Find that balance. And part of that is doing your homework ahead of time and understanding what opportunities there are at that institution where you're interviewing. Did I answer your question? I got off on the sidetrack, I think.
It's okay. We got it back. Is there anything that would be like completely off-putting or even potentially lead you to rescind an offer? Like, can you mess this up?
Well, I'm a huge believer in that you need to treat everybody with respect. So, and unfortunately, I have occasionally, very rarely, have candidates who don't treat my admin or our service line administrators or the kind of the staff that are helping me explain benefits, not treat them well, and that's a no-go for me. I feel like if that interaction is just as important as the interaction they have with me or any of my faculty.
Awesome. So I think we've got a lot of the questions so far. Like I said, we are going to have a broader Q&A session at the end so that folks that need to get off to, sign out and things like that can do it, but lots more opportunities to ask questions, and this will be included in the recording.
So Liz, I saw the question about maternity leave. You should definitely ask about that question and make sure you know, and that there can be subtle support of that, right? So you can say, yes, you can take all the maternity leave you want, but ask the question, are you going to have to make up time on each end, right? Because you may get all the time off, but if you're having to make it up before or after, whether it's your clinical time or your call, that changes the flavor of that getting time off.
For sure. Okay, so more from Chris in a bit. I do want to share, I've given talks like this in various venues in and outside neonatology. So I have interviewed several practice managers and division chiefs, and you've probably heard a lot of these themes already. Are you seeing my slides? Mm-hmm. Yes, excellent. So again, just make sure that you are personable, right? Being rude will get you nowhere in this process. Be as honest and transparent as you feel safe doing. Again, private information does not help you along this process. I think everybody is very invested, particularly when you get to the stage of making an offer in your career and your success. Don't be afraid to ask things. We're going to get into some more detail about gender differences and how people negotiate. Whenever possible, have a rationale and data behind the things that you're asking for, and not just, for fun, I want to ask for it to see if I get it. Be very timely in your follow-up. If you say 2 weeks, mean it. And don't take things personally. Sometimes it's just not an opportunity that I can afford you in this negotiation process. And sometimes it's no now, but it may be possible down the road. So be open to that. I also interviewed a whole boatload of people who had just been hired. These are their top tips. Okay? Don't be afraid to stall. Most hires in any given year are of people fresh out of fellowship. So that means everybody is juggling the same differences between I have first interviews here, second interviews here, I already have an offer here. Okay, so just be transparent about that and don't be afraid to ask for more time. Whenever humanly possible, get it in writing. It's great when somebody says, oh, I'm sure in 2 years we can reduce your clinical time for X, Y, and Z, but if you can get it in writing, it means a lot more. Money is not the root of all happiness, so consider all these other things we've talked about negotiating for. And understand that the number one reason why people leave a job, particularly their first job, is work-life integration concerns. So keep that in the forefront as you consider what you need out of a position, and don't hesitate to get a lawyer. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Savage now. I'll be driving.
All right. So I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting us. This is a very important panel for all of you looking for your first jobs. And with the recognition that over the past many, many years, women have had lower salaries, not only in medicine, but all fields and in pediatrics as well. We're focusing on negotiation for women in neonatology, but I have a lot of helpful hints for the men listening in on this. Next slide. So things are not fair in medicine, and we're going to look at some salaries, leadership promotion, and then salaries for women in medicine and neonatology. So next slide. So just to remind everybody, in the early 60s, when we looked at the number of women that were in medical school, it was less than 10%. And there was a gradual increase over 30 years. And since about the 1990s, there have been 40 to 50% of medical students that are women. And since about 2016 or 17, over half of the medical school matriculants have been women. Next slide. And you can see from the red box that actually since about 2017, more than half of the med school students are women. So that's the dotted line. So we are now outpacing the men in terms of the number of women in medical school. So you would think with all these past years of having things equal that there should be no problems. Next slide. And you can see that neonatology and pediatrics are very highly represented by women in our field. So this is the percentage of residents and active physicians as of 2019 who are female by the specialty. And you can see that residents entering in terms of pediatrics and neonatal medicine, the green and the red bars, arrows at the top, are two of the highest. OB-GYN is just a little bit higher for residents. And for active physicians, you can see that pediatrics and then neonatal medicine has a very, very high percentage of women in our field. And then as you can imagine, the surgical subspecialties are much higher represented by men. Next slide. And for the past many years, this is about 2005, the dotted line are the percent of female fellows that are entering into neonatology. And you can see now it's about 70% women as first-year neonatal fellows compared to about 30% men. And that's sort of increasing slowly over the years, but it's been holding pretty steady and similar to all of pediatrics and all of pediatric subspecialties, becoming more women dominated. Next slide. So let's talk about some of the salary disparities that we're seeing for women in medicine, pediatrics, and neonatology. Next slide. So just overall, we know that as of 2022 data, men are earning about 50 to 60,000% more than women. And this number really is not changing over the last few years, even though there's a lot of attention. So in primary care, it's higher for men, and it's almost 100,000 more among specialists who are male that are earning more than women. And again, the numbers are not budging over the last few years in spite of a lot of attention being paid to this issue. So these are all physicians. Next slide. And no matter what specialty you're in, except for radiology, whether it's neuro, OB-GYN, peds, any surgery, cardiology, in every subspecialty, the males are earning more than the women are in that subspecialty. So this is just a pervasive problem throughout medicine. Next slide. And you can see that when you look at the percent of women in a subspecialty compared to the salary, you see that pediatrics has the highest percentage of women, and it also has the lowest salary. So our lack of negotiating for all of us, men and women in pediatrics, for equity compared to our male counterparts is really hurting our field as a whole. And the fact that we have so many women in pediatrics really is bringing this even further down compared to where it should be. Next slide. So there was a recent article in JAMA that looked at gender-based disparities in academic medicine and looking at the disparities in earning potential. So they were looking at starting male and female academic physicians in the first 10 years and wanted to evaluate, are there really differences in starting salary and salary growth? So no surprise as to what they found. Next slide. So they did adult medical, adult surgical, and we're going to focus on the pediatric medical. And you can see that the starting salary was almost $10,000 higher for men compared to women for all of the pediatric subspecialties. And at year 10, this increased for men compared to women of almost $20,000 higher. So instead of the gap getting better over time, the inequities increased over time. And this added up to about $214,000 less over that 10-year period. And just a 1-year delay in promotion reduced the 10-year earning potential by $26,000. Next slide. Now looking at all of the pediatric subspecialties, and we're going to focus on that red bar that's neonatology, but you can see the darker blue-gray bar is the starting salary, and then year 10 is the lighter color. For each subspecialty, if the bar goes to the right, the men are earning either a larger starting salary or a year 10 salary. And you can see for neonatology specifically, the men for the starting salary were earning at least $30,000 more. And at year 10, it was almost $15,000 more. Now, again, this is in spite of everyone saying the salaries are not negotiable. But when you see that males compared to females are getting a higher offer, there has to be some implicit bias for those that are offering, and I'm sure this is not Chris Reber, but those that are offering the salaries are justifying that they are giving the men a little bit higher salary because they have in their mind perceived higher value. So you do have some negotiation when it comes to that initial salary, because we see that even the latest data show that men are still getting offered higher salaries. Next slide. And again, when you looked at the earning potential in the first 10 years for women versus men, again in neonatology, you see that men over the first 10-year period had a higher overall salary of over $2 million in that first 10 years. So these are significant numbers. It's worth really taking the time to get a good negotiation when you start, because you will never make up that salary difference if you don't have a good starting salary. So next slide. So we did a survey a few years ago looking at neonatologists. We looked at all factors that went into what is the job that the neonatologists do. And when we looked at what are the differences between men and women, so we looked at all neonatologists, this is in academics and in private practice. Number one is we found no differences when comparing the average number of clinical shifts, scheduling, call, patient volume, team members, outpatient clinical duties, procedures, or moonlighting. So we worked very similar hours and weeks compared to the male and the female. So we all worked about an average of 18 weeks of clinical, whether it was academic or private. And the number of clinical hours per year were pretty much exactly the same for male versus female. So one justification for the lower salaries women have been getting is that people have said, oh, they're working part-time, they're not working as much as the men, they're not doing as much. And we really have evidence that that is not true. The jobs are exactly the same. Next slide. And again, we found from this recent survey that gender alone, so that red arrow, accounted for a $37,000 or a $35,000 difference alone. So this is taking into account how many years out of fellowship, whether you had leadership, whether you were the division chief, all those factors, and gender alone in neonatology counted for $37,000 salary difference. And you have to think about, if you had that money and were able to invest it, again, this is pre the recession that we're going into, but let's say an average annual return of 6%, by the time you retire, a woman would have made $3.5 million less over her entire career than a male doing the exact same work. So this makes us think we have a lot to do when it comes to negotiation, and not only at the beginning, but throughout our careers. So the next slide. So let's look at quickly some leadership differences. So we know from our survey that women are much less likely to be at the professor level, again, similar to all of medicine. Next slide. And again, we see this in all of medicine. Women are still vastly underrepresented when it comes to the professor appointments. And again, this is important because professors have more leadership and they have more salary equity. Next slide. And again, looking similar to the salary issues, we found in our survey that gender alone, when it comes to things like being a division chief or the president of your practice or the group leader of your practice, or being the chair of an institutional committee chair, gender alone was about 3 times more likely to occur if you were a male compared to a woman, factoring out all of the other issues that go into appointing someone as a leader. Next slide. So let's go into negotiation. So what is negotiation? And Liz did an excellent job of highlighting this. It's an interactive communication process that occurs when we want something from someone else or they want something from us. And keep in mind that you have a lot of value that you are bringing to that division or to that group when you go into the negotiation. So don't sell yourself short. You have a lot of value to them. Next slide. So life is full of negotiations, big and small, personal and professional. Next slide. Keep going. Why does it make us uncomfortable? Well, there's conflict sometimes in negotiation. There's competition. Are you competing against your fellow fellows? It's risky. You don't want to appear too aggressive because then you might not be liked. We've talked about, Liz mentioned, you're going to meet these people again in the future. You don't want to hurt the relationship in case you need a job from them in the future. You're impatient to get this negotiation over with. And then there are the recognized gender aspects in the negotiation. And it's difficult being at a power and a hierarchy disadvantage in the negotiation. Next slide. So there are gender differences when we approach negotiation. For men, they look upon negotiation more as a competition or a sport. They expect to have to ask for it. They know what they want. They understand everything's negotiable, that it's okay to be aggressive, and they importantly ask for more than they expect to receive. Whereas women, generally, we're looking for consensus or we're looking for building a relationship. We expect the world to be fair. We expect less and we ask for too little. Generally, we want to avoid conflict and we want to be agreeable. And as a result of all of these issues, we concede too much too soon. Next slide. So again, view it as an opportunity. You may not get everything you ask for, but if you ask for it in an appropriate way, it will still be a good opportunity. There are no right answers. You might give a little and get a little. It's really important to manage your emotions, especially for women. Become comfortable with ambiguities, but it is important to get things in writing. And it's really important that you develop good communication skills during the negotiation and before the negotiation. You want the ability to ask questions, but also listen and then to advocate for yourself. Next slide. And again, adopt a solution-focused approach, not a winner-take-all, but working together. So if you're looking at bargaining or negotiation as a positional distributive bargaining approach, that assumes it's a fixed pie. So more for me means less for you. That is more of a competition. It's a win-lose. And that is, like we talked about, single issues like buying a car, one-time interaction. Next slide. But we're looking to expand the pie. You want to focus on underlying interests, not just your position, seeking to understand the why of the person that you're negotiating with. Why can they not give more salary, but maybe they can give more bonus? You want to form and maintain that positive relationship, be collaborative and creative, and have a win-win solution all the way around. Next slide. So a reason gaining attention for the pay disparity is that female physicians don't negotiate as aggressively as their male counterparts, and some don't even negotiate. Of course, women we know are just as capable of negotiating, but not enough of us do this for themselves. We know studies have shown that men tend to initiate negotiation about 4 times as often as women, including in medicine. And in comparison, only about 20% of women don't negotiate at all, even when they think they ought to. Next slide. So they're more cautious. Men, they'll apply for a job when they meet about 60% of the qualifications, whereas women wait until they're 100% qualified for a job. And again, don't accept that initial offer without negotiating. Next slide. So again, for women negotiating, they also have fears about hearing the word no, and they don't want to appear adversarial. They're more likely to be unsure about how do you ask for a request or what to ask for. And again, in the chat, you've all been asking, what are the things you can ask for? We'll send out this slide set, but at the end of the slide, if we don't have time to go through it, I have a lot of detail on what are all the things you should think about asking, things you might not even thought about. But again, talk to other people about what to ask for in negotiating. All of you in fellowship should be talking to all the other fellows or the fellows that graduated ahead of you. What did you ask for? What do you wish you had asked for? What was it not worth asking for? And practice your request with others. So practice sessions with your fellow fellows or maybe with your mentors. Next slide. So I'm going to go quickly through these common scenarios in medicine to be understanding why the negotiation is such a different experience for men and women. So there's Carolyn and Mark, 2 hard-working neonatology fellows, both smart, looking for jobs. They both want to stay on at their institution. Mark has already been talking to his program director at the beginning of the 3rd year to let him know that he's interested in staying. Whereas Carolyn just thought, I'm going to do a little bit of extra work. I'll volunteer to do the fellow scheduling. They're going to see I do a good job, and they're going to notice I do a good job, and they're going to ask me to stay. Next slide. So Carolyn and women like her unknowingly concede too much of their own professional development to someone else. So they're not getting to the negotiation table in the first place. So solution, don't wait for an invitation. Develop your wish list. 1 to 5 year career plans, chunk it down to action steps, and share them with your boss or who you're interviewing with. Next slide. And again, men are more comfortable self-promoting and accepting responsibility for their own career development. Men will take credit for their success and say it's because they have a specific talent or work ethic, whereas, and many of us are guilty of this, successful women will downplay our skill sets and claim that they were just lucky or they're part of a team. And again, as I mentioned, men will more likely put their names in the hat for a promotion or a position, even if they haven't yet mastered all the prerequisites for the new position. Women are going to wait until they're fully qualified. Next slide. So Carolyn says, well, she's going to see whether the starting salary is negotiable, told it's not, it's standardized, and that she might be eligible for a bonus after she passes her boards. So she gives up. But Mark is told the same thing, but then he negotiates moving costs, professional dues, and a 2-week Christmas vacation for his wedding. Next slide. So concept of what's actually negotiable. It's important to consider salary and non-salary items, and we've talked about many of these things, but women can miss out on these perks because they can be oblivious to their existence or not privy to the casual conversations where they're discussed. So the men are talking to the men about these are the things you should ask for, but we don't have our network as developed as the men do and know that we can ask these things. Next slide. So find data, again, getting the AAMC, talking to the other fellows that are going through salary negotiations, network with your colleagues, search the databases, talk to people at these conferences that you're going to, and ask if you can talk to the people that were recently hired at job interviews. Ask them what they had or wish they had negotiated for prior to signing. And if they don't want you to talking to anybody that was recently hired, that might be a red flag, but that might not be a practice you want to join. Next slide. So follow up, they're going back for their second interviews. Mark knows he's going to get an offer, expects to negotiate. Carolyn is just grateful and undecided. She thinks, gosh, simply getting a job would be great. And she'll already be making a lot more money than she did as a fellow. And she figures she'll be in a better position to negotiate if she waited until she had proven her value. Next slide. So threshold to initiate. So just being told that you can negotiate makes it more likely that you're going to negotiate. It went up from 17 to 58% for women and 59 to 83% of men. So just practice and expect to negotiate, and you have much better outcomes. Next slide. And many women feel it's just not worth the negotiation. Whatever benefit might gain is offset by the awkwardness of being told no, or that their anxiety that they might not get what they want. So they're just going to avoid it. Next slide. And desensitize the negotiation by practicing. Start with low stress, low consequence situations. Go to a supermarket. Ask if you can get a discount without the membership. Work up to bigger things like getting a free oil change with a car inspection. And again, when you do these practice negotiations, you realize you can successfully negotiate for a lot more, and that even if you lose out on a negotiation, it's not such a big deal. Next slide. And that even if you take a lower salary than that you deserve, remember, you are not going to make up the difference during the course of your career, as future salaries are based on your initial salary. So there still is a range sometimes of salaries that can be offered for someone, and you want to negotiate for the high end of that range if possible. Next slide. So Carolyn's thrilled. She realizes it's time to negotiate, but can't seem to bring it up. She wants to make a good impression. She doesn't want to appear high maintenance or entitled, so she stalls and asks a few days to look over the contract. Next slide. So women really want to be liked, and this is a real possibility. If you're too aggressive, you might not be liked. Dominance is a little harder for women to pull off because it's at odds with another female prescriptive of deference. So we're all competent, but dominant females do tend to have a harder time because they buck those ingrained, unconscious societal expectations. Next slide. So modify how you negotiate. Really go at it as it is going to be a collaborative kind of negotiation. That you're getting something from the institution you're negotiating with, but you're also bringing something to the table. So work together and collaborate on how each party can really benefit instead of someone winning and someone losing. Next slide. And so Carolyn's still playing around, trying to figure this out, hasn't really talked and finalized her negotiation. And when she finally makes contact, she's just so flustered because the director doesn't have time. She agrees to the offer and she just says, well, whatever. And then she also agrees to start 2 weeks earlier. And then she's just relieved to have it all over. Next slide. So prepare and positively prime. Give your boss advance notice by setting up a meeting to discuss your requests and proposals and your professional development goals, and have your data ready. And prime yourself by recalling a really personal, empowering event, such as an award you got or when someone told you you did a great job. So you really feel like you have a sense of accomplishment going into this. Next slide. So 5 strategies, and then due to time, I'm going to end this. Preparing fully, cultivate positive emotions, boosting your emotional intelligence, negotiating communally, and negotiate an entire package. Next slide. Oh, again, just one more thing. You have to be able to network. So get mentors, get sponsors, get champions, and let them help you get the best possible position that you can. And I don't have time to go through the rest of my slides, but it really goes into some more helpful hints, some things you should not do during a negotiation, and then a list of all of the other things that you want to think about negotiating that goes into much more detail, especially for those of you that are looking at an academic research career. And we will send these slides out to everybody.
So we've already put into the chat the resource guides that includes academic papers, a MedEd portal workshop, and a series of articles and TED Talks that may be useful to you in navigating this process. We're going to open for additional questions. If you are not multitasking in the chat, I'll point out a few things that were hot topics. So can you ask folks about their salaries and other things they negotiated for? Absolutely. So certainly if you know somebody that is an easier lift in terms of just being able to reach out to somebody you have a previous relationship with, but it's perfectly acceptable either in the interview process to ask who are the recent hires and make contact with them, or in the process of negotiation to ask the practice manager or the chief, who are the folks that have been hired in the last 1 to 2 years, and then make individual contact with them. They may be evasive, they may be very transparent, they are highly unlikely to flat out lie to you, but if you don't ask, you will have absolutely none of this insider information. So while it's a bit uncomfortable at times, I recommend that you do it.
Yeah. I would also say for women, we all talk about transparency. We really need to be sharing our salaries because that is the only way that these inequities will be addressed. When we realize that we have been making less than the men or someone equally accomplished, but we're not getting the salary that they negotiated. The only way is if we share this information.
There is a small subset of folks who are potentially listening to this who may have a very unique position where there may be significant differences in salary. So for example, if somebody is dual trained, that may be a situation where there is a higher merited salary. So take that into consideration if you're talking to other folks in the group. But there may be some equitable differences in salary in unique situations. And as Chris alluded to, certainly somebody more senior in their career with a significant leadership role may merit a different package of offer. There were several questions about getting stuff in writing. This question comes up all the time. So I'd love to hear from Chris. There's certainly things that you negotiate a polite agreement on, but are there things that rarely will actually make it into a physical contract or offer?
So I do think there are some things, definitely, if you want to negotiate support for some education, that type of thing. I think you have to be a little bit careful. I navigate this all the time with clinical time. Folks will say, but my contract says X. Well, first, I don't ever try not to put in a contract, this is how much clinical time. Understandably so, right? As a division chief, we have to cover our clinical service. But I can tell you exactly what my goal is and how many people I'm hiring and what we're doing. But it really ultimately is at the discretion of the division chief, any clinical time, because you all know that we have to have our NICU covered. But the questions you want to ask is, okay, so if I have to work more clinical time, what is your approach? And I would say, like for me personally, it's, well, I'll pay you moonlighting if you have to work above X amount of time. That is what my goal is. And I will advocate for. So those are the kind of questions, but it's hard to get in writing. I will only do so many weeks of service because that flexes, right, depending on beds opening or people leaving or things like that. I
would also say when you're looking at a contract from an academic center and even in private practice, they're mostly just going to address the salary and maybe possibly a sign-on bonus. Mm-hmm. They may have an indication of what the minimum number of weeks, but all those other things you're going to negotiate, like money for professional development or being on a committee, just send an email or write a letter getting that in writing with the person you're negotiating. As we discussed, as I understand, my professional development will be X, or I will be able to go to 5 meetings that will be supported by other, expenses. So get those things in writing, but they're not going to be in your contract.
Right. That's a good point.
Completely agree. Ashley asked, if salary is difficult to negotiate, should you concentrate on other aspects? Yes, right? I would encourage you to pursue both, right? So you may come back with a request for a salary adjustment and get a very transparent answer of this is what we've hired the last 4 people at, and this is the starting salary, and I can't offer more than that. But if you haven't actually posed the question, there will never be a consideration of salary adjustments. So as we point out clearly, somewhere many, many people are receiving inequitable salaries, hence the roll-up data. So don't take for granted that the individual program that you are applying to is already considering salary equity in your offer.
I see another question. If there's a no to an initial ask, but it's a high priority item, is it acceptable to ask again? It's always acceptable to ask again. I think at some point you have to say, well, is this a deal breaker for me? I would be very transparent and say, I don't have any room to budge on this, or let me see if I can come somewhere in the middle with this, depending what it is. But you can always ask again, but you have to make the decision about whether that's a deal breaker for you or not.
Right. That comes back to the BATNA. So it may genuinely be a deal breaker, and that's fine. Again, leave it as a respectful, we just can't align our values at this point, and that's fine. There's a question about a non-compete. What should you look out for? So non-competes typically have 2 components. They have a time component, and they have either a distance or a pre-specified list of places that you cannot work. So really make sure you understand the nuances of those 2. So for example, if your contract says 40 miles, well, get the map and figure out what's 40 miles away from where you work. Because if there's another program that would be on your radar, if this job doesn't work out, you need to know if they're in the catchment area ahead of time or not. You also need to consider the time. So non-compete can vary anywhere from typically 2 years to 5 years. The longer it is, if it pushes past 5 years, there may be more opportunity to defeat that in a legal battle should you choose to pursue it. Because there is a clause saying that if a non-compete is so prohibitive of your ability to have an income and a job, that it may not be defensible in court. But typically you would want, in the perfect world, the shortest non-compete with the smallest radius. And again, you need to decide how much of a deal breaker that is or isn't as you decide if you want to accept an offer. Other questions?
So one of the questions that came over in the people asking questions before the chat was, how can you negotiate your schedule? And yes, you can. I mean, it may be that group, everybody does X weeks and X amount of night call, but it may be that because of your personal situation, you're willing to do a little bit more night call. So you could have a few extra weeks not on clinical service to be in the lab or do research. Or for your family, you might not want to work as many weekends, but you're willing to do more nights during the week. So a schedule is negotiable. There may be some schedule that is equally shared, but there may be the people in the group are willing to share with you, or that all of the clinical service is not filled and people are expected to moonlight or fill in the gaps. And there may be some budge on you do more nights and someone else will do more weeks, or you don't want to work nights because they tire you out, whatever. Be aware though, if your group is based on RVUs for your bonus, because RVUs are really going to be generated during the day with seeing patients. So you can do a lot of nights, and if you don't generate RVUs, which you generally don't, if that is used to look at your productivity through the year, that can be a problem.
And it's worth also asking, even if schedule is assigned in a very specific and equitable way, is informal adjustment permitted? So if you have the flexibility to say your partner is going to take night shifts, or I'm going to split a weekend 24 with you, is that allowed? If that is pertinent to your consideration of this job offer. I think back to that point of how much do you negotiate for? You're really prioritizing what's important. So if you are not going to take or leave this job based on whether or not this tiny little nuance is acceptable, then it may not be worth including in your negotiation process.
And I do just want to say, I know we talked about negotiation, and you should absolutely negotiate. But I have said to some graduating fellows, there's very little that you can negotiate, and don't feel like you have failed if the things that you ask for, you don't get this first go around, right? I would be very transparent with you and say, this is what I'm giving the other 8 people that I'm hiring who are on the same level as you. This is what my first years out are making. So you're very comparable. I'm giving everybody a $10,000 bonus. I'm giving everybody a $10,000 moving. So I would be very transparent about that. So don't feel like a complete failure if it comes back saying everything is no. Now, when you're negotiating as a division chief, there should be a ton of things that you're negotiating, right? And there should be a ton of things so it varies depending on where you are. So this negotiation piece is extremely important, especially as you move along in your career, because then you have more to differentiate yourself based on your skill sets, your leadership skills, and what they're hiring you for. But I think I would absolutely ask, and you should practice these skills. Like Renata said, you should practice being a negotiator. We really do it every day with our parents and maybe with our babies sometimes. But you should definitely practice those skills and not feel embarrassed by any means. And I would tell you, if you were negotiating with me, not to be embarrassed, ask, and I will have an open dialogue with you.
The other point is we know that half of fellows will go into a private practice setting or a non-university setting. And in those settings, the salary is often much more negotiable than it would be in an academic center. Mm-hmm. So it may be that if you're going to Chris's program, she does not have the ability to budge much on the salary. But if you're looking at a private group, especially a smaller group not owned by Mednax, you may have a lot of ability to negotiate your salary or what your service looks like. So keep that in mind, that, we're all at academic centers, so that's our world. But we also know in private practice, it's very different what you might negotiate.
Mm-hmm. Two random points, one that was in the chat, but in case it passed you by, when you're considering negotiating with smaller groups, particularly private practice groups, there is data supporting the fact that the higher percentage of women in the group, the less salary inequity there is. It seems kind of logical, right? So if you're applying to a job with a private practice as a woman and every single employee in that private practice is a man, that should be a potential red flag for you. Another issue that came up in several questions is this concept of a lawyer. So I cannot give you necessarily individual legal advice, but I'll distill it to two core situations. So number one, if you receive a contract or an offer and there is enough legalese in there and you are enough legalese naive that you do not understand what you are agreeing to, and you don't have necessary mentorship, maybe like informal contract review through your hospital lawyers, through mentors who have experience negotiating contracts, if you feel unsettled that you don't know where you're agreeing to, you need a lawyer. The other situation where I would highly advise you to have a lawyer is if you have an inkling that you may be inclined to break this contract for whatever reason. So let's say you've gone through your job process and you have a dream program, they're not hiring, you take your next best choice and you're signing this contract. In the back of your mind, you're like, if only a job opened at this other place, I would bail so fast. And then lo and behold, the job opens up at your dream place. And so if there's even a possibility simmering in the back of your mind, employing a lawyer to review your contract, to understand what are the escape clauses, and to help you navigate the process of negotiating out of a contract can be very important.
Perfect. Thank you so much to our speakers and our moderators today for making this such a wonderful session for all of us. Thank you to everyone who participated live and for all of you who are viewing this after the fact. As a few reminders, again, the recorded link, as well as the chat text, the slides, and the resource guide will be sent to all who registered. Please give us feedback on this session following the QR code. The link to the survey was also placed intermittently through the chat. And then lastly, be on the lookout for that post-job search final survey, which we send out in March or April of 2023. Please help pay it forward by providing some of those details of your individual job searches so that we can best cater to future neonatologists who are coming up the pipeline. Thank you again for joining us today. Have a wonderful day.
Good luck. I know it's stressful, but it's also fun.
Yeah, good luck. Yes, I was going to say, enjoy the process. You get to meet a lot of people.
Good luck, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Renata, do you have your whole speech recorded for WIN by any chance?
Do you want to start